outraged at the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota, again, as a result of police irresponsibility to a person of color. And I want to talk about what that can mean to us in the state of Washington, all of us in the state of Washington. And I emphasize all of us, whether we're people of color or not, because the denial of one person's liberty, in this case, was a denial of one person's life. And when that happens, everyone's liberty is reduced. So I would suggest that there are three concepts or values, if you will, that we need to consider in thinking about the last few days' events and the upcoming future. And I want to stress that I think these values are not inconsistent with another. I think they actually are entirely consistent with one another, because they all point to the necessity of justice in our community. The first concept is that people are reasonably and justifiably outraged at seeing the tragedy that unfolded in Minnesota. There is absolutely no justification for it, and the visceral, strong, and I hope universal revulsion against it is something that should not be minimized. And the ability of Washingtonians to speak out against that, to demonstrate with their feet and with their voices an outrage about that, is not just enshrined in our Constitution, to some degree, in a sense, as a responsibility. Because we know that we want change if we're going to have justice. And these folks, the thousands of people who were peaceably demonstrating, were asking for both. And it is something enshrined in our Constitution, the ability to petition one's government for redress of grievances is actually a constitutional right. And we ought to respect that and understand it in that context. But that concept is not inconsistent with the second value proposition, which is that violence and destruction has no place in this. It is not productive, and it is not constitutionally protected. The fact that people started fires that endangered human life in Seattle a couple nights ago, totally unacceptable, not constitutionally protected. And we know that many of the people who were peaceably demonstrating were urging those people to knock it off, sometimes to no avail. So we know that those folks need to be criminally prosecuted as appropriate, and they will be. And while we condemn that damage that was done, there's another concept, I think, as we rightfully condemn it and prosecute it, and that is we will not allow that to obscure the justice of the underlying protest, that the peaceful protesters' efforts to challenge all of us to raise our eyes on the prize, to have a more just society, we will not allow that message to be diminished or obscured by the violence. We just can't allow violence to hijack peaceful protest. And I think that's something we all need to hew to. The third concept is that we have so many voices who are there to inspire us, to prop us up, to give us hope that, in fact, we can continue this march on the road to compassion and justice. Just mention some of them. When I woke up, was it yesterday morning now, and saw hundreds of Washingtonians just spontaneously go to the streets of Seattle at dawn to help heal the city of Seattle. I saw 10-year-old girls sweeping up glass. I saw people scrubbing off walls. These people came unbidden. It was a visceral reaction of respect for their community and the desire to heal so we can get back to the job of demanding justice. That was really inspiring to me, and I hope it's heartening to many people. And that was not a message to reduce the cry for justice, but it was a recognition of our ability to have a dialogue free from violence. I was encouraged to see the Floyd family today. One of his relatives says that keep protesting, but stop looting. To have a family recognize in the midst of this grief and tragedy that looting is not acceptable behavior, frankly, that's the kind of leadership we need. and it came from a family who is now obviously in grief. So in the midst of this heartache and tension and concern, I think there are many voices in our state that can help call us to demand change, demand it in a way that respects our individual rights, and really does believe that we can improve our state. And I believe all three of those things can happen. We know we need more education about racism in this country. We know that many of us, myself included, have not been able to experience what people of color go through every day in our society, and we've got to continue to focus on that individually as well as from a public organizational standpoint. And I think that's an important part of this component as well. I want to give you just a little description of what the state's involvement was to try to protect people's right to peaceably protest while simultaneously reducing the risk to our health in the state of Washington. We had a request from the city of Seattle at 3 o'clock day before yesterday to render assistance from the National Guard. We effectively immediately effectuated that with the help of Major General Brett Dougherty, who's on the line to answer questions. As you know, when guards, men and women, are activated, they have to leave their families and leave their jobs and come to a muster point. They did that, and they were actually on the streets. Usually it takes 24 hours to do that, but they were on the streets of Seattle that evening. It was a very rapid response, and we're appreciative of that. My understanding is that they helped guard critical infrastructure to reduce the property damage. We appreciate them. They are neighbors. And the reason I say that is the members of the Guard are not some occupying force. They literally are our neighbors who put aside their families and come serve in a moment's notice, as they did the day before yesterday, and are continuing to do so. We increased the number of people. That was an initial 200 people. We've increased that, and as of last night, even sent some of the members of the Guard to Bellevue at the City of Bellevue's request. The state had also put into action about 200 members of the Washington State Patrol. They were on duty assisting the Seattle Police Department, both on traffic efforts and try to replace some of their coverage in their general duties. We appreciate both of the patrol and the Guard for their service. I should stress that the Guard are unarmed peacekeepers. They are there to help support the local community. So we're doing no different. Their service is no different than is provided during fire seasons or what they're doing for our COVID-19 response. In fact, I was told that some of the guards that were on the streets of Seattle the other night are helping us in our contact tracing against the COVID-19 virus. These folks do double duty. And the way this works is that the Guard will respond when local leaders request it. So this is very much something that is requested first by the local communities, and the state then renders that assistance. I want to mention something that I think is clear to us, is that it's been a hard time for the state of Washington, and it's been the hardest for some of these communities of color. The health and economic impacts of COVID-19 have fallen disproportionately on communities of color. And I hope as we recover both from COVID and as we continue to seek justice, we can find ways to reduce that impact that has been disproportionate. I do believe we are going to make progress on this together because we all understand our responsibilities. And that is multiple. It's not just on the politicians. It's on all of us as we come together. Now, if I can just close a comment, I think our country needs leadership right now, and that leadership comes in all sizes and packages. But I'll just share something that's always been an inspiration to me of a moment of leadership. It was the night that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And as I recall, my dad came and told me about that. And there's something that has always stuck to me that night, that Robert Kennedy that night was before a crowd of, I believe, predominantly a black audience. And he had to share the news of what happened to Martin Luther King. And obviously that was something that would have the most profound emotional response to all of us in the nation, particularly that audience. And I just want to share what he said, because it's the kind of leadership that I hope can inspire us all. So this was a night in 1968. This is what Kennedy said. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion towards one another, and a feeling of justice towards those who still suffer in our country. I don't think I could say it any better. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I'm sorry, my dad cried that night, so did I. I miss him. Okay, well, one last thing. Tomorrow we will issue an extension of our eviction moratorium that is set to expire Thursday. It will include some modest adjustments. And because we're still significantly impacted by COVID-19, continuing these protections is necessary at this time. I understand that by and large, tenants impacted by COVID-19 are paying what they can, when they can. Both tenants and landlords must work together during this crisis. The extension of the moratorium encourages increased communication between tenants and landlords to achieve a smoother transition. And I'll continue to work with our partners in the legislature and otherwise to see that we continue that. With that, eager to stand for questions.
Hey, Governor, can you speak further to the President's comments today on his call with governors, where he said many governors will weaken their response to non-peaceable protesters? And also, referring back to COVID in the state, will the ongoing protests change the state's COVID strategy?
In regard to COVID, I would say no with this exception. I think it has, or hopefully will, illuminate the need to have all our efforts to be inculcated with the desire to reduce inequity that we have in our state. And that inequity is profound. It predated COVID, but the COVID virus has illuminated those differences. The infection rate for black people in our state is well above the per capita rate. The same is true for Hispanic members of our community. And that ought to be a signal call for us to look for opportunities to reduce inequity in our society in a whole host of issues. We have done what we can in that regard. We've certainly done things in the agricultural labor safety issue, where so many Hispanic workers have been subject to this virus. And our efforts to reduce that infection rate is certainly a just thing to do, as well as a healthy thing to do. The economic impacts has fallen disproportionately on the black community, who have suffered more in job loss, in many of our service industries and otherwise. So fundamentally, our efforts will continue the same strategy, but I'm hopeful that it will give added emphasis of the things we will do to be supportive of people. And if I may, just for a moment, this is beyond the scope of your question, but I do want to say this. We know about how visceral this tragedy is of this killing in Minnesota, but there are so many other things that we need to address because of racial inequity in our society. Certainly the economic inequities are profound and persistent. The educational opportunities still are disparate. The need for early child education is not fully fulfilled. The disparate access to mental health and physical health are things we need to continue. This is one of many of the things we need to address in our society if we're going to have a truly just and equitable society. And I do believe what we've seen in this outpouring of anger is not just because of this disparity, but the larger disparities that we have to commit ourselves to to be that blessed community that Martin Luther King spoke of. So out of this, if this helps us continue this march to economic justice that Martin Luther King spent the last years of his life addressing, I hope that will succeed. And COVID-19 will be just part of this. The president's comments, leadership looks like Robert Kennedy and his comments. And I have to say that the comments by the president have not been in that vein. They have been rooted in a desire to fan the flames of division rather than to call us to a higher purpose. And I have to tell you, governors were shocked at his comments today. I think they are more like rants of a very insecure man than a person asking us to find the better angels of our nature. And I think the most helpful thing the president could do at this point is to enjoy silence and let governors do the great work and very tough work they're doing. Look, it's Republicans and Democrat governors both right now who are doing all they can to reduce the risk to people's health and safety while simultaneously recognizing the right to protest. And this is tough work to do both at the same time. Many governors have called out the National Guard, including myself, within hours of this incident showing that it was needed. And I want to stand up for those governors, both Democrats and Republicans, who are doing this hard work right now.
Next question comes from Joe at the Seattle Times.
A question for you or the Adjutant General. As we head towards another evening here, can you give us a state of what the National Guard is doing right now? Or are there members positioned in Seattle, Bellevue, Spokane, other places, or have they stepped back at this point?
General, you want to answer that?
Sure, I'd be glad to, Governor. We have approximately 300 soldiers and airmen that are in position this evening to handle any threat that might come up. And the governor mentioned where they are. We'll be back where we were last night, clearly in Seattle, Bellevue, Spokane. And so we're prepared, and we'll be there with our police partners again this evening.
Great. Next question comes from Keith Wiscoma.
General and Governor, along those lines, the president says you need to get tougher. Is there a possibility, if things start to get really out of hand, that you would arm the National Guard and give them weapons to head out on the streets?
General, you want to talk about that?
Sure, glad to, Governor. You know, we always arm ourselves to the level that's appropriate of the threat that we face. And right now, that threat appears to be looters that are breaking windows and stealing merchandise. Clearly criminal activity worthy of being arrested and sent to jail, but not deserving deadly force. If that threat were to change at some point down the road, then I would go to the governor and discuss this. But right now, we think that we're armed appropriately. And I think that what we have seen the last couple of nights bears that out.
Okay. Next question comes from Jim with the Spokesman Review.
Governor, I'm wondering, first, did you express to the president what you just expressed to us about his comments? And secondly, what you talked about, the issues that need to be addressed, is that something that you would like addressed at a special session, which seems to be somewhere on the horizon?
I think the underlying needs we need to build a more just and equitable economy are longstanding. I don't think they're going to be different than the other things that we need to do. We know we need to have better early child education. We need to continue to build our mental health care system. We need to finance the ability to help people finance college education. All of these things are going to be something consistent with whenever we get the legislature back into session. So it probably is not independently needing a session, but it does need a solution. And whenever they get back into session, this is going to be a high priority, as it's been for some time. And I may note that our state has been on the road to justice. Look, we've been one of the most successful states to expand health care in our state. It's very important to people, communities of color. We have expanded probably the best financial aid package for people in the United States, particularly people in the lower income brackets, extremely important for increasing access and equity. We have got the first state to have a long-term care health program for people so they can age in dignity. We have raised the minimum wage as much or more than anyone else. We've adopted the best paid family and medical leave program in the United States. All of these things are steps on the road to justice that I think were consistent with the vision of Martin Luther King. But I'm sure he would say we are not at the promised land yet, and there are many more things to do to have a more equitable economy. On your issue about the president, I did not respond to him. I did not think it would be productive. I think he knows where we're coming from, and I think that my sentiments are shared by the vast majority of governors who are astounded by that ranting of the president today.
Next question comes from Essex with Kyra.
Yes, Governor, a question for you and a question for the general. First for you to follow up on what might take place in a special session. Is there anything, knowing the need for justice, is there anything in the special session that you would do to assure that the interactions between police and people of color are just? And can you really protect some of those social services that you talked about now with a declining economy because of COVID? For the general, you talked about potentially arming National Guard troops should it become necessary, but the situation has changed so quickly that might be too late. Why not arm them now?
Go ahead, General.
Okay, Governor, glad to. Thanks for the question, Essex. We're pretty flexible in what we do, and besides that, we're surrounded by fully armed police officers there. We're not there just by ourselves. If we were all by ourselves, perhaps we would go to the governor and request that we be armed. But the police have got enough weapons on site there to do what needs to be done if the threat was to get worse. And I always look at this as the risk versus the reward. And the risk right now of an incidental shooting, I think, just outweighs the value of having people armed right now, especially when we have our police partners fully armed. And all you have to do is take a look at what has happened in other states such as Kentucky. We don't want that happening here in Washington.
Your question about accountability, we have had our state voted overwhelmingly to improve our police accountability statute. That happened fairly recently, and that obviously is on the books. We also have improved our training to train police officers in de-escalation techniques so that they can try to reduce the potential of violence, to try to calm the waters when they roll up to a scene. And I think that our state has been frankly admired. It's been called sort of a template by the other states in this regard. We want to keep that up and make sure that officers get that training. And yes, there are budgetary challenges. We want to make sure that type of training continues. And by the way, that training is not the end all and be all. As long as racism exists, it's going to have multiple ways to attack it, not just training, but we need to continue that training. The social services, we are very concerned about this. We have a $6.5 billion or more hole in our budget, and we need to be as effective as possible to maintain these vital services. And I'm going to look forward to the legislature having the courage to do that.
Next question comes from Jerry with the Everett Herald. Jerry, are you there?
Jerry, the Herald?
There I am, I hope. Am I there now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask about small towns, the situation in Snohomish, for example, last night, concern about potential looters and violence. A number of residents came down armed to the downtown area, and in the words of one, were to defend, observe, report, and assist law enforcement. I'm just wondering if you could comment on Snohomish, and would you like to see more of that in communities or less, and why?
Well, look, police officers are the ones really trained and have the responsibility to keep us safe, and that probably is the first order of safety that we would encourage. Look, we want to keep people from loss of life. If it's small comfort, there was no loss of life the last couple nights. That's a good thing. That's the one thing we can't replace. And I just encourage people to recognize that's the highest order of business, and be safe. Keep yourself safe. That's what I would say. General, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure, Governor. I would just ask people to remain calm and please don't run around with weapons. Let's just keep our heads level and on our shoulders and work our way through this. But we're not armed because we don't want somebody shot by accident. And the more weapons there are at a site, the more likely you are to have an accidental shooting. The police have got the weapons. The governor is absolutely correct. They're the right people to have the weapons. And the rest of us just need to take it easy. So please, just everybody calm down, leave your weapons at home, peacefully demonstrate as much as you want to, but let's not make this a situation that is worse than it has to be. That's my 2 cents.
By the way, we want to thank our police officers and our fighters. I saw firefighters rolling right up to burning cars when there was all kinds of chaos going on, and that takes some gumption. We want to thank them for that.
Time for a few more questions. Next question comes from Hannah with Cairo Radio.
Hi, Governor. I'm down here in Seattle where several hundred people are already gathered for another protest tonight, so far peaceful. We heard early on from some of these people that they were upset that local leaders didn't come out and speak earlier about what happened to George Floyd. So I'm curious about your take on that. And then also, how concerned are you about COVID and spreading in a second peak, given these protests we've seen in the last several days?
Well, look, I think people know how important it is. COVID's not going away while we're dealing with our other challenges. So we really encourage people to be safe for themselves and the people around them. You know, if you wear masks, you are protecting the protester next to you. Please protect the protester next to you. And to do that, it involves wearing a mask. And I hope people will do that and distance as much as you can. We just hate the thought of peaceful protest that is legitimate in protesting an outrage in Minnesota could end up in fatalities due to a virus in Washington state. So we hope people will be mindful of that. Look, I don't know about others. I've spoken out against this. The outrage is palpable in this regard, and it cuts close to our heart. I kind of broke down a few minutes ago because I remembered the night violence took Martin Luther King. And I think all life ought to be preserved. That's why I'm speaking out.
Next question comes from Jim with the News Tribune.
Governor, I was wondering what your thoughts are on what the congressional response should be to all this. There's been some talk about requiring the Department of Justice to investigate bias-motivated crimes at the federal level rather than referring cases to states and localities.
I haven't thought through that, to be honest with you. I think the most obvious thing that Congress could do is help the local communities deal with these threats by helping us financially. This costs the counties and the cities and the state pretty significant amounts of dollars to have law enforcement, firefighters, transit officials to do extra duty. And one of the things the federal government could do and the president could do is to pass the bill that has already passed the House of Representatives to help these local counties and states fill these giant holes we have in our budgets because of COVID-19, and now this. That's the most obvious thing that I can think of. Now, as I've said, we've made some improvements in the recent past in our state, and we're alert to other suggestions, by the way. We are going to be having a dialogue on this with multiple communities. I was in a discussion yesterday with leaders in the Black community. I'm having 2 more this afternoon, and we're open to ideas in this regard, both federally and state. So stay tuned. Maybe somebody will have some more ideas.
Last question. Final question comes from Carolyn with the South Seattle Emerald.
Hi, yes. I wanted to double back a little bit. How does the state plan to enforce pre-existing laws regarding police misconduct, given the number of eyewitness reports and video evidence showing officers instigating violence against peaceful protesters, including macing at least one child in Seattle? Will the Attorney General be involved in investigating this?
Well, you need to ask the Attorney General, but I am confident there's going to be thorough investigation. The mayor made that clear. There may be multiple ways to look at those incidents. And I know that we will get to the bottom of any potential argument that there was inappropriate conduct. That's very important to the success of this mission, and I know that'll get done. I will suggest the question going to the Attorney General about his particular plans in this regard. But it's important to have an independent review of these to really get to the bottom of what happened, because that will not be countenanced from any police force at any time at any place in this state. No, I want to thank people who want to focus on justice and respect for both our rights to protest and our rights not to suffer from violence. Those are both important values in Washington, and I want to thank everyone for trying to promote both of those things. I saw a sign the other day. I was walking in a neighborhood here, and this family had put a big sign out in front of on their big front porch, and it said, better days are ahead. I believe that's true, and the more we commit to those values, the faster that will happen. Thanks very much. Please wash your hands.